Great. Thank you, Sarah and Nancy, for having me here, and all the good folks at the Plainfield Public Library and the Drake House. So as you can see here on my screen, um, today I'm going to be talking about military shelter and the War of Independence based off of my book that just came out last month called Surviving the Winters. You can see the very lovely cover that the publisher has given me here. And those of you from the area might recognize the structures on this cover. These are, in fact, the soldier huts at Jockey Hollow, part of Morristown National Historical Park, where I worked for about 10 years. So maybe some of you have kind of seen these on a hike or a visit to the park. And for 10 years, I kind of directed folks visiting the park on how to get to the huts. I occasionally did little talks and programs at the huts. And over all that time, I got interested in the topic of the huts themselves, these little log cabins where Revolutionary War soldiers would spend up to 6 months a year. And I discovered that no one had really written about these before, so I endeavored to write about them myself. And a few years and 250 pages later, and there's a book out about it now. And I'll talk a bit this morning about how these huts came to be and what their significance was to the wider Revolutionary War. So at its core, the soldier huts and everything else I'll be talking about today are aspects of shelter or housing. And I frame this book and discussion as a sort of discussion of military housing. And what I found in researching this topic is that not many historians had looked at military shelter, military housing. Military history is a very broad field, and there have been numerous books written on even just the Continental Army, covering it from almost all aspects, be it battles and tactics, generals and generalship, uniforms, recruitment, how the army was fed, how the army was paid. If you can kind of name a topic, somebody has likely written about it when it comes to the Continental Army, except for shelter. And I found that a little bit odd because shelter is a basic human need, right up there with food and water. And again, there have been several books written about how armies have been fed, but that other kind of component there, shelter, I found that no one had written a whole heck of a lot about. You'd see brief mentions of tents, you'd occasionally see mentions of soldiers in barracks. There were, of course, references to the soldier huts at places like Valley Forge and Morristown, but no one had ever really done an in-depth study on it. And again, I found this odd because shelter is a basic human necessity. Soldiers needed shelter pretty much every single night, otherwise they would be exposed to the elements. And it's something that armies throughout history have needed. On the slide here, you can see a picture from very recently, back in January when the National Guard deployed to the nation's capital, and soldiers were forced to camp out in a parking garage because there was no other shelter available for them in the city. So almost 250 years apart, we've got American soldiers kind of grappling with uncomfortable conditions in the winter because they don't have the shelter that they need. And that brings us to specifically looking at winter shelter, or shelter in general, during the Revolutionary War. Now, I do talk about all types of shelter in my book, be it shelter in the summer and fall months when the army was on campaign, but my big focus is on winter shelter, or what we call winter quarters. And winter quarters are important because the winter is the time when shelter is most important, obviously, because you have colder temperatures, snow, wind, ice. An army exposed to those conditions is going to be in much bigger trouble than an army that lacks shelter during the summer. Winter quarters is a little bit of a misnomer. It's a phrase that we use, but They're really winter and spring quarters. Armies generally retire to winter quarters in December and don't begin kind of active campaigning again until the following June. So they spend about 6 months stationary, conducting minimal operations and mostly just struggling to survive. The reason they have to wait until June is because the spring months, at least in North America, are fairly wet. And the dirt roads get kind of covered in melting snow and rain, and you really have to wait till June for the roads to dry out. So when we're talking about winter quarters, we're talking about these sort of 6-month periods when armies are mostly stationary. And again, these are the periods when they need to be most concerned about their shelter situation. Now, winter quarters tend to go overlooked in military history. Lots of books about various wars and armies will typically end a chapter about a campaign saying, and then the army retired to winter quarters, and then you flip the page to the next chapter, and it picks up in the spring with the next campaign about to begin. And that entire winter and early spring period is overlooked. Now, there is an exception to that rule, and that's, of course, the winter quarters at Valley Forge during the American Revolution, which most people in the United States are familiar with. You go all the way back to elementary school, there's sometimes mentions of Valley Forge. I have quotes here from two of the more popular college history textbooks still used today, The American Yawp and Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty. And even today in 2021, you can see that college textbooks still give a brief blurb about what happened during that Valley Forge winter of 1777-78, which is infamous for very cold conditions, soldiers sort of struggling through these chilly winter months, bad supply situations, soldiers going hungry, issues with disease and exposure. And we frequently see this sort of 2,500 to 3,000 number quoted for the deaths suffered during this winter quarters. So the point here is that we usually overlook military shelter. We usually overlook winter quarters. You'd be hard pressed to name a famous winter quarters from the War of 1812 or the Civil War. But during the Revolution, we have a very famous one, Valley Forge. And those of us from New Jersey, likely in attendance, are of course also familiar with the Morristown winter, which when I worked there, we always used to discuss how it was worse than Valley Forge in terms of weather, even though a lot fewer soldiers died. And then of course, the folks at Middlebrook will say, well, between Valley Forge and Morristown, there was the Middlebrook winter, which gets overlooked to an even greater extent. The point here is, again, that during the Revolution, at least, it seems like these winter quarters were pretty important. We have national parks that preserve them. They're still mentioned in history textbooks. So for whatever reason, the Continental Army's winter quarters during the Revolution were pretty darn important. And one of my tasks in my book was to really delve into why that was. Why did people at the time and subsequently choose to focus on the Army's struggles during the winter and how they overcame them? So to better understand kind of why winter camps like Valley Forge and Morristown stand out to us and why they're seen as so important, I had to first look at sort of what the situation was with military housing in winter quarters before the Revolution. Basically, look at the origins or the backstory of these camps to understand what made them so significant during the Revolution. So we have to understand that the Continental Army is an army that inherited its traditions from other European armies. So mostly the British, but to a lesser extent, the French and the Prussians. These European armies that had kind of matured during the 18th century formed kind of the blueprint or the model that the Continental Army would follow, be it with uniforms, equipment, tactics, etc. So first we have to look at what those armies were doing with their housing. And what we find is that on campaign, so during the summer and fall when armies are actively marching and fighting, most armies took shelter in tents. This might not seem that surprising. I think if you go to a reenactment or watch a movie from this time period, you'll see soldiers in tents. But tents were something of a development during the 17th and 18th centuries. Tents were not cheap. You needed sort of productive capacities to make all of the cloth needed for tents and distribute it to the armies. So it's not really until the late 17th, early 18th centuries that you'll see soldiers reliably having tents when they're in the field. And even then, tents were not universally available. In bad weather, tents were not a great option. If you tried to tent in the rain, your tent would get damaged and you might not get a replacement for a long time. Tents were heavy and had to be carried in wagons. So if your wagon train got delayed, you might be without tents. So quite frequently when tents were not available, we would see soldiers resort to billets. Billeting basically refers to quartering in a existing structure, usually either a public building or someone's home. So it would be a common occurrence in the wars of the 18th century to see an army march into a village and the commander tell the local village elders, hey, we're spending the night here, clear out your tavern, make space for our soldiers, tell your civilians that our men are going to be kind of sleeping in their barns and hay lofts and sometimes rooms in their houses. And while this might seem odious to us today, this was a commonplace activity in the wars of the 18th century. And finally, you had shanties, which are basically just any sort of rudimentary structure you could quickly assemble from twigs and brush and sod and whatever you had readily available. So campaign housing differs from winter quarters. Again, when kind of fighting shuts down come December, what do armies do then for housing? Well, tents are out of the question. You're not going to want to spend the winter in a tent. So most armies resorted to billeting. Armies would essentially spread out and kind of detach their men to every village and city in the area and try to camp their men out in houses and taverns and inns and then reassemble their army come spring. Increasingly, they would supplant billets with barracks. A barrack is a purpose-built large structure to house soldiers, usually made of timber and stone. They were quite expensive, but by the middle of the 18th century could be found in France and to a lesser extent the German states. So if your army was fortunate enough to be near a barracks, that would provide some very substantial housing for you. In North America, we see a number of conditions that make it difficult to follow this European model. British North Americans inherited this sort of opposition to standing armies, this sort of intellectual or ideological bent that meant that they resisted the idea of billeting. And if you're familiar with the kind of stories of the Boston Massacre and the Quartering Act in the run-up to the Revolution, this is probably not news to you. So it was much harder to get civilians to agree to billets in North America. Even if they were amenable to, there was another more fundamental problem, which was that North America lacked urban centers. It was just a much less urbanized area than Central or Western Europe, meaning that there were fewer cities and towns and fewer built structures that could provide housing. There was a lack of barracks as well. There were a handful of barracks built during the French and Indian War. You can see the old barracks in Trenton in the background of the slide as an example of those, but only ever enough to house a few thousand soldiers, certainly not 10 or 20,000. And the colonies early on also lacked tents. So even in kind of summer campaigning, housing might become an issue. So not only did kind of practical experience in Europe inform future Continental Army leaders of how they should house their soldiers, They were also reading the sort of guidebooks and treatises and military manuals of the day. A lot of these were focused on these sort of basics of building a camp and kind of maintaining discipline and cleanliness in camp. You can see an example of that here with this quote from Sir Humphrey Bland's treatise of military discipline, where he talks about how soldiers need to dig necessary houses, what you and I would refer to as a latrine, and keep them separate from their drinking water in order to render the camp neat and clean. If you think about an army as a sort of concentration of 10,000 bodies that when it's camped out for weeks or months on end is going to produce a lot of human waste, and kind of managing that waste is very important in keeping your army healthy. So a lot of these guidebooks emphasize that. Some of them also looked at camps and quarters from a strategic viewpoint. This quote here from Essay on the Art of War by a Frenchman discusses how a general should basically be very cautious in where he places his winter quarters and keep an eye on his enemies. If his enemy should deploy his army in a vulnerable spot, you might be able to take advantage of that. And I have these two quotes here because we know both of these books were in Washington's library. So they likely informed his decisions about quarters during the war. So the Revolutionary War breaks out in 1775, and the war's first campaign occurs up around Boston. There's an army of about 22,000 men that's gathered to besiege the city of Boston, which is held by the British at the time. And pretty early on, there's the realization that these 22,000 men will need shelter. The war's first year indicates that shelter is going to be a problem for the army. Very early on, there's again a lack of tents, and you have a lot of men kind of resorting to building these little shanties all around the city. They try to sort of progress from that to billeting, where they'll kind of put soldiers into buildings and houses in Cambridge and Roxbury and kind of the other towns surrounding Boston. This again is a problem because it's disruptive to civilian populations. If you billet your men on civilians, they're going to turn against you and not support the cause. Spreading the army out into all these little towns also makes it harder to train and discipline them. So again, pretty early on, the army realizes it needs a better solution. So it tries to build barracks. Washington actually issues orders for 120 structures, each large enough to house 100 men, to be built during the winter of 1775. But they discover that this is really beyond the army's means to accomplish. Structure large enough to house 100 men needs a lot of building materials. It needs skilled labor, and neither of these were available in the Boston countryside. You can see a quote up here from General Nathaniel Greene, who basically says that there's not enough wood in the area to build the barracks Washington wants, and most of them actually go unbuilt. I have a little drawing here I found of Harvard Yard in Cambridge just after the war. And I think this building at the top with the flag on it might be one of these barracks built during the Boston winter. But most soldiers that winter probably would have been quartered in private homes and college buildings and other such structures in the area. So overall, the Boston winter indicates that barracks are going to be difficult to build. Billets are not going to be popular and have their own problems. The army still doesn't have enough tents, even for the warmer months. And spending such a long time in one spot leads to a lot of hygiene problems. Again, keeping camps clean and drinking water safe is a problem, and that's only going to get worse as the war drags on. The one saving grace that winter was that a lot of these 22,000 men didn't spend the entire winter in the army. Most of them were militia and would go home for weeks or months at a time, meaning the number of men that Washington needed to house at any one point was considerably lower. And this mix of billets and barracks and shanties and tents was enough to kind of muddle through that winter. So that brings us to the following campaign, 1776. This is when Washington fights to defend New York against a British attack that leads to the Army's defeat on Long Island, the loss of New York City, and briefly the loss of New Jersey before Washington famously counterattacks on Christmas night, 1776. In the background of my slide, you can see the famous Emanuel Leutze painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. So this is another one of these campaigns that's fairly famous from the Revolution. What I found is that if we look at the campaign from this prism of housing and shelter, it helps us better understand why Washington basically suffered a major defeat at the outset of the campaign. Again, in the summer of 76, a large continental force, over 20,000 men, had gathered in the New York area. And quickly we see that housing and hygiene created all sorts of health and morale problems for the Army. You can see the quotes up here that I've kind of arrayed in chronological order on my slide. These are mostly from Continental officers. There's a couple in here from Washington as well. And we can chart as the campaign progresses how the Army's housing and health situation declines. So in July, the Army is in very good health. But by August, there's a number of men getting sick every day. And this is because the Army spent a long time occupying one spot in these camps where they did not do a very good job enforcing hygiene regulations. So men didn't take baths. They again sort of dug their latrines very close to their wells, polluting their drinking water. And by August and September, the Army is basically facing a dysentery epidemic in their camps. They're bringing in new recruits who are ignorant of all these basics of military life, so they quickly fall ill, get homesick, and then sort of plunder the area and then go home. So really undermining discipline. When Washington was defeated on Long Island at the end of August, he retreats and abandoned New York City itself on the lower Manhattan tip. Doing that, the Army lost most of its tent supplies in its retreat, but also lost access to the houses and barracks in New York City itself. So by October, the Army has got very few tents left, so they're more exposed to the elements. Discipline has gone down considerably, and with that, sort of keeping the water and other health items clean is a problem. So we see soldiers writing in October that camp fever, which is basically dysentery, has weakened them considerably. By November, the Army's retreated again into Westchester County, where they've only got a few tents available, and a lot of men are sort of exposed to the elements on a nightly basis. In November and December, the British invade New Jersey and force Washington to retreat back to Pennsylvania. You can see this quote here from that December: "No tent to cover us at night, exposed to the cold and rains day and night." So when we look at this several months campaign where the Army progressively gets more ill and progressively loses its housing stock, I think it better helps us understand why their performance was not its best on the battlefield, and also helps us appreciate just sort of how hardy the men that crossed the Delaware that night in December 1776 and fought the Battle of Trenton the next day and the Battle of Princeton a week later. These men had basically been without a roof over their heads for a good 2 months. And one of the reasons why Washington likely did not pursue the campaign further after Princeton, he basically marches up to Morristown and ceases major combat operations, is because the men were exhausted. Now, one of the positive outcomes of the New Jersey campaign is that from January onwards, Washington now has access to all the little towns in New Jersey, like Morristown and Chatham, where he can billet his men fairly comfortably for the remainder of the winter. So basically, if we look at the 76 campaign through this prism of housing, we see that a lack of housing and poor hygiene in camp undermine the Army's ability to fight a successful campaign, leading to the loss of New York and briefly the loss of New Jersey. Conversely, the kind of counterattack at Trenton and Princeton recovers decent housing for the Army, which they can then use for the spring as they rebuild their force. So in the spring of 77, the Continental Army rebuilds, and from 77 onwards, it's a very different army. The first 2 years of the war, the Army was very short service, basically only 1 year enlistments, usually which expired around January. So winter housing was not as big of a problem as it could have been because a lot of the Army went home. But come the spring of 77, Congress approved long-term enlistments. Soldiers would now enlist for 3 years or longer and stay under arms throughout the winter. So unlike the winter of 75, 76 or 76, 77, the winter of 1777, 78 meant that Washington now had to really address the winter quarters problems. And during that winter, he finds himself not in Boston and not in New Jersey, but in southeastern Pennsylvania, where the British had recently captured Philadelphia. And in late November and early December of that year, the Army debates sort of how it should winter its troops in these new conditions, where they need to find housing for about 15,000 men. A lot of Washington's generals wanted to follow what was considered the European practice, which would have spread the Army out into billets throughout the Pennsylvania interior. So sent men to Lancaster, sent men to York, sent men to Allentown. But Washington eventually decides that's not a good idea. A lot of those towns were full of refugees and likely would not have had space for soldiers. Training and disciplining men when they're spread out to 5 different Pennsylvania counties would have been tough. We already know that civilians were not supporters of billeting. So instead, he embarks on a sort of novel proposal to keep the Army together in a single encampment, just like you would a sort of tent encampment in the summer or fall. But since tents won't provide good protection from the elements in winter, he decides instead to have the men build log huts. And in December of that year, he issues these general orders saying he's going to take the entire Army to Valley Forge, which is about 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, and put the entire Army into these uniformly built 14 by 16-foot log cabins. This, again, had never really been done in Europe. Armies billeted, they barracked. Building huts for winter was almost unknown as a practice. And there were a number of officers at the time who didn't think this was a good idea. You can see some of their quotes on my slide here. Colonel Henry Livingston basically looks jealously at the British, who were going to billet their army in Philadelphia for the winter. General Huntington complains that he wishes he had better quarters. Captain Samuel Shaw says, this is kind of a tall order. You're asking us to kind of go into the woods at the end of December and spend weeks building these huts where we then have to spend the remainder of the winter. So this was not necessarily popular as a decision because it was very new, but it does provide better housing than tents, and eventually the Army will construct 2,000 of these log huts at Valley Forge. We find that, like any sort of new endeavor, the Army gets some things right and it gets a lot wrong in their first winter in log huts. They provide more compact quarters than billets, as mentioned, fewer civilian disruptions, and they're fairly warm as long as you can keep the hearth inside with enough firewood to keep it going. They found that you can keep about a 50-degree temperature inside. so more comfortable than a tent. But in terms of negatives, they prove to take a long time to build. The Army made a very last-minute decision to winter at Valley Forge, and therefore had not arranged for all the tools you would need to build a hut to be available. So building them was difficult. They never really figured out a good way to cover the roofs. So a lot of them were just made of turf and sod, which proved to be very leaky in rainstorms. They did not have good drainage. So when snow started to melt and spring rains arrived, a lot of the huts started to flood. More importantly, occupying one spot for 6 months on end with an army that was still not very well disciplined led to an accumulation of human waste and animal byproducts and trash that by June basically inundated the encampment. So much so that the Army actually had to abandon Valley Forge in June of 1778, not due to enemy action, but because they basically left the place a mess, full of, again, waste and other things that bred disease. By June, about 30% of the Army was sick and in the hospital. And we find that those 2,500 to 3,000 men that died at Valley Forge didn't die during the winter when it was snowy and cold, but in the spring when they caught dysentery and yellow fever and typhus and measles and other sort of camp illnesses. And again, you can see some quotes here from Washington, basically ordering General Greene to find better ground for the Army because they were abandoning their camp. And a pension written after the war, or a pension application post-war from a common soldier who even decades later remembered leaving their filthy huts at Valley Forge. So Valley Forge, again, had some qualities that were positive, it had some that were negative, and it left it up for debate whether the Army would again want to sort of spend the winter in these kind of damp and crowded and potentially dirty huts. In 1778, the Army kind of shifts back to New Jersey to keep an eye on the British in New York. And there's another debate over winter quarters. And there are a number of generals who say that Valley Forge was not a good experience. We should not aim to repeat it. And therefore, again, we see sort of proposals to sort of spread the Army out and billet it from Albany all the way down to Baltimore, which again would have spread the soldiers out, made it harder to discipline and train them, potentially left them more vulnerable to an enemy attack. But we see support for this. You can see a quote here from General Horatio Gates, one of Washington's rivals, where he basically says that he doesn't think soldiers are going to really want to try and build huts again. But there's also support for hutting. A number of generals feel that if they get a second chance to kind of build their winter quarters and improve upon Valley Forge, that they can kind of get things right. And these generals ultimately sway Washington. So on November 25th, he writes a letter to another general, Israel Putnam, where he says, "It's my desire that soldiers should hut themselves as they did at Valley Forge whenever they can." And from late 1778 onwards, we see this sort of hutting for winter quarters become the principal way that the Continental Army will house itself for the remainder of the war. In selecting their winter campsite for that winter, we see more consideration of logistics. So kind of placing the Army where it can be more easily supplied. We see a stronger emphasis on health and hygiene. So building huts that will be cleaner and kind of arranged in a more healthful manner, as well as considerations of where they'll be safest against British attack and where they will keep the kind of local civilian leaders happy. And because of this, the Army opts to kind of place most of its troops at Middlebrook, so kind of up the Raritan River near modern-day Somerville, a place where they can be easily supplied. Wagon trains can kind of move over flat central Jersey terrain to bring them supplies, yet also secure from attack up in the Watchung Mountains. a kind of ideal location. We also see a number of orders that improve the build and kind of administration of the huts themselves. Uh, since there's a sort of earlier decision for winter quarters, they can make better arrangements for their construction. So tools are stockpiled in the area. It takes a regiment over 150 tools to build their huts, everything from saws and axes to adzes and lathes and other sort of carpentry elements. All of these are stockpiled prior to winter quarters to make it easier to build the huts so they're built faster. Local sawmills cut shingles for the roofs, so they're no longer using sod and turf, which cuts down on leakiness. Washington orders drainage ditches built away from the huts to carry all the kind of outflow of water and whatnot away from living areas. Officers are much more attentive to kind of forcing their men to make their latrines a mile outside of camp to, again, keep the drinking water preserved. And because of that, the Army passes the Middlebrook winter in much better shape than Valley Forge. The sick rate declines from 30% to 10%, which is where it basically remains for the rest of the war. And you can see all these positive quotes coming out of Middlebrook. Washington says the Army is better clad and more healthy than ever before. Continental Army doctor says our Army is remarkably healthy. General Anthony Wayne remarks that we are much improved at city building. So I've said this in other talks I've given in the area. The Middlebrook winter, in terms of health and cleanliness and hygiene and effectiveness of the Army, is really its high point and something of a turning point in the war that has gone overlooked. So I'm going to jump forward a slide here to the following winter, 1779 to 1780. And this winter will eventually become the sort of famous Morristown winter, where the soldiers kind of quarter at Jockey Hollow. But for our purposes, I want to briefly discuss the sort of debate over where the Army should quarter that winter. And how it almost led to a winter encampment much closer to Plainfield. So in the autumn of 1779, Continental Army was again sort of pondering where it should place its winter quarters. And there's a number of orders from Washington saying he wants to put the winter quarters at a place called Quibble Town, which is roughly in the area of modern Scotch Plains and not too far from Plainfield, basically on the forward slope of the Watchung Mountains, about 10, 12 miles away from their previous camp at Middlebrook. It's not entirely clear why they didn't just want to reuse the Middlebrook campsite. It's possible that they may have kind of cleared all the easily available firewood there, meaning that it'd be hard to kind of keep their huts warm for the winter. Washington also had a slightly larger concentration of troops that he wanted to winter in New Jersey. So it's possible that he needed a slightly different campground for that. Regardless, Quibbletown, which you can see in purple here on my map, offered most of the advantages of Middlebrook. And in September and early October, that seemed like it was going to be the Continental Army's next big winter quarters. However, at the end of October, the British launched a raid into New Jersey, where they landed at Perth Amboy and kind of marched up the Raritan Valley and attacked the old winter quarters at Middlebrook, which were still being used as kind of storehouses and places where they would repair wagons and artillery and boats. And the British actually managed to burn a bunch of the old huts at Middlebrook and damage some of the equipment there before they withdraw. And it seems that this raid sparks kind of a panic in the Continental Army High Command, where they realize that the British might be a bit more aggressive this winter than previous years. And because of that, maybe a forward deployment on the eastern slopes of the Watchungs would be too vulnerable to a British attack. So in early November, Washington basically says we're going to fold up this idea of wintering at Quibbletown, and we need to find somewhere else to winter. And this starts a month-long, what amounts to a geographic survey of northern New Jersey by Nathaniel Greene and the Quartermaster's Department, where they search for a suitable campsite somewhere more secure than Quibbletown or Middlebrook. And Green subordinates go out into the countryside and they kind of look for everything from will wood be available? Is the ground dry enough to support healthy huts? Can the site be supplied? Is it secure from the British? And he gets literally dozens of reports of possible campsites. And I've marked a couple of them. Greene himself wanted to camp near where Patterson is today, near the Great Falls, a site that would have been a little tougher to supply, but had just great terrain for building a large campsite. On the other hand, another general, Anthony Wayne, found a good site down in the Sourland Mountains, which would have had some rough terrain to protect it and could have been easily supplied by the Continental Army's supply hub at Trenton. But neither of these were secure enough against a potential British attack. So Washington rejected both of them, which caused General Greene no end to his frustrations. You can see Washington lamenting that it's very hard to find a campsite that can be easily supplied, well protected, and a good place to build huts. And then Greene kind of responds with exasperation. It's going to be really hard to find a place that checks off all those criteria. And eventually they settle for the sort of Jockey Hollow site below Morristown, which is much more secure than any of these other sites. It's about double the distance from British bases in Staten Island and Manhattan. It's behind the Watchung Mountains, so an added barrier. To its detriment, it's tougher to supply. The roads are more mountainous here, more prone to being sealed off by the snow, and not quite as good for building huts. And one of the reasons why the Army deals with a lot of supply issues during the Morristown winter is because it is this sort of compromised site. But this is, again, the sort of decision-making that leads to it. And had things broken a little differently, we might be talking about a Quibbletown National Historical Park instead of a Morristown National Historical Park. So we're running out of time, so I'll begin to wrap things up. The Middlebrook and Morristown winters establish a precedent of the Continental Army essentially building these vast hut complexes, or what I call log hut cities, in secure terrain in northwestern New Jersey and the Hudson Highlands area of New York State. And basically for the remainder of the war, 78 through 1783, for about 6 months a year, the Continental Army will spend its time at one of these log hut cities, be it Middlebrook in 79, Morristown / Jockey Hollow in 1780. Both of these winters see significant numbers of troops deployed to the West Point area. And from 81 onwards, the amount of huts and more permanent structures like barracks built at West Point provide housing for the Army in increasing numbers. So in 81 and 82, most of the Army actually winters in the West Point area, and then in 83, further north at New Windsor, as well as a series of smaller log hut villages in places like Pompton and Reading, Connecticut, that will also be used throughout the war. And again, these are all more secure from British attack because they're in rough terrain. They provide good housing for the men, improved discipline and administration, cuts down on the disease problems and supply problems as well. So really, we can understand the second half of the Revolutionary War in the North as Washington pursuing this kind of cautious strategy of keeping away from the British and securing this vital terrain and keeping his army secure in all of these fairly cozy log hut cities. You can see an image of what these cantonments looked like by the end of the war here. This is the mural at Jockey Hollow at Morristown National Historical Park. A modern image, but gives us a sense of what these hut cantonments looked like. So if we again put this in context, the Army starts out with trying to billet and barrack their men, as well as kind of place them in tents when needed. At Valley Forge, they implement this log hut city for the first time, not 100% successfully. But by Morristown and after, the Army's gotten pretty good at building and maintaining these log hut encampments, which again provide them secure and healthy quarters, which means that every spring and summer and fall, the Army emerges from the winter much better prepared to campaign and fight. And one final postscript, again, to relate things back to our wonderful host, the Drake House and Plainfield Public Library. This method of quartering soldiers in log huts is reused in subsequent mobilizations and conflicts by the US Army. Basically, it's a system that's proven that it works, so they're going to continue to use it. In 1799, the United States had a brief bit of tension with revolutionary France called the Quasi-War, and Congress actually approved a rapid expansion of the US Army, which was then deployed to a number of encampments to train for the winter and potentially protect our major cities. In the winter of 1799, so again, 20 years after the revolution, 3 regiments of this new army actually spend the winter at Plainfield and Green Brook, which is kind of in the same area. And this is in some ways your last Revolutionary War winter camp. George Washington, who's retired as president, but was actually nominally in command of this new army. Alexander Hamilton, who had served as Washington's aide-de-camp in the Revolutionary War, was really in command of this army. And they build these sort of mini Valley Forge, mini Morristown type log hut cantonments. And the one in New Jersey was right here in Plainfield. And we see Washington issue general orders for this army saying troops should be hutted in the manner they were in the late war. So again, the same sort of model used at Valley Forge and Morristown. On the right here, you can actually see a blueprint for laying out the huts for this camp in Plainfield. They may have experimented with a slightly different design of hut that departed from the 14 by 16 foot model used in the Revolution. This is a proposal sent by an officer at Plainfield to General Hamilton with sort of 2 different floor plans for how the huts should be built. It's not entirely clear if they adopted these or not. John Adams, who was president, appointed his son-in-law, William Smith, to command the troops at Plainfield, what was called the Union Brigade. And Colonel Smith's wife, Abigail Smith Adams, so John Adams' daughter, mentions in a writing that she's traveling through Springfield and Scotch Plain to Plainfield, to the place where Colonel Smith is encamped with these 3 regiments. And there's a lot of other writings, and hopefully this will be a future research project. I know Nancy at the Drake House is also working on this. But again, just to sort of wrap things up and give a little bit of local color to this story. And even beyond the Quasi-War, we do see American armies using log huts all the way into the War of 1812. You can see a quote up here about that. There's a military dictionary for American troops published in the 1850s, which includes models for how to build huts. And during the Civil War, American armies built huts by the thousands, as you can see here in a photograph from that war. So in conclusion, housing helps us understand kind of how the Continental Army fought the War of Independence, what problems it faced, how it matured as an army, and ultimately how these sort of log hut cantonments first pioneered at Valley Forge formed a backbone of Continental Army strategy. Housing intersects with such topics as health and hygiene when we look at camp illness, administration and kind of discipline in the army, morale, civilian relationships, social history, which we do not have time to get into, But basically all the things historians are interested in when they study conflicts and war, we can gain a better understanding of when we look at military housing. And kind of at the heart of this story is this sort of log hut cantonment or log hut city pioneered at Valley Forge, something that even General Horatio Gates, who we saw earlier as a critic of these types of housing, but by 1782, he's come around and he refers to the Army's last winter quarters at New Windsor, New York as something new in the art of war. And that's really kind of where I'll leave this. The Continental Army inherits a lot of European traditions, but it also innovates. And we see one of those greatest innovations here with the log hut city. So that's where I will close things out, but certainly happy to answer questions and clarify and any of that. If you'd like to ask me anything that we don't have time to get here today, you can follow me on Instagram at East Jersey Steve, Twitter at East Jersey Steve, LinkedIn at Dr. Stephen Elliott. If you'd like to buy the book, it's available on Amazon and from the University of Oklahoma Press website. And I've been informed that Plainfield Public Library has ordered a copy. So you can always check that out from your local library.